In one of his most insightful works, called The Abolition of Man, C.S. Lewis warned about the ways that the modern world is changing us. He argued that modern education and modern ways of life have abandoned a central conviction that many earlier generations took for granted, which is that men and women shouldn't pursue or act on their desires, but rather instead that we should all have our desires properly educated. In other words, Lewis was suggesting that what we want isn't just a matter of personal taste, that there are right things to want and wrong things to want, and that our hearts need to be taught what those are. Near the end of the book, he goes on to say that if we don't do this, if we don't take charge of educating our emotions and desires, then what will ultimately happen is that those who have enough money and power will form us however they see fit. Once our souls, that is ourselves, have been given up, the power thus conferred will not belong to us. We shall, in fact, be the slaves and puppets of that to which we have given our souls. That may sound like an overly pessimistic exaggeration, but there are good reasons to think that what Lewis warned about may well be coming true. In 2019, a leading American historian named David Courtwright published a book with Harvard Press entitled The Age of Addiction: How Bad Habits Became Big Business. In this book, Courtwright explains how over the 20th and 21st centuries, more and more businesses began to produce goods and services that would offer short-term pleasure that would, in fact, be addictive in some way to consumers, be it certain types of food or cigarettes, gambling, or simply scrolling on a smartphone. The power of these products comes from their ability to target the limbic system of our brains, which is why Courtwright gave this business trend the nickname limbic capitalism. Limbic capitalism, he says, makes up a significant portion of the consumer market. And the problem with it is not that the goods and services it offers are inherently pleasurable. The problem with it, he says, is that the business model is built on heavier and heavier consumption. In other words, if these businesses are going to be truly profitable, what they need are not simply consumers, but addicts. And so that is exactly what they do. There are people out there working full-time to make sure consumers, regardless of their class or morale, have their eyes glued to the screen and are buying six-packs. What was it that Lewis warned? That if we give up our souls, that one day we would become slaves and puppets of that to which we had given our souls. Apparently, this is precisely what some businesses are aiming for. And for Christians, that's a serious problem. Not just because it means we're probably buying and consuming more than we should, but because the Bible, much like C.S. Lewis, is filled with warnings of what will happen to us if we give ourselves over to our appetites and pleasure. In Philippians chapter 3, the Apostle Paul urges us to imitate him and others whose lives reflect a single-hearted obedience to Jesus. And then he issues a warning. For many, he says, walk as enemies of the cross of Christ. Their end is destruction. Their God is their belly, and they glory in their shame with minds set on earthly things. Their end is destruction, and their God is their belly. Of course, Paul did not have contemporary consumerism in mind when he wrote that, but his description is still very apt. Because what he's saying is that there are people who are not really in control of themselves. They are slaves to their belly, to their desires and appetites. In Galatians chapter 5 and Romans chapter 8, he refers to those who are controlled or led around, he says, by the desires of the flesh. Here, he describes them as those whose God is their own stomach. And when he says that, he's not making an observation that's unique. Ancient Roman authors like Seneca and Sallust made similar observations, describing some people as being slaves of their bellies, by which they meant those people who allow their basic appetites to control their behavior. The Syrian satirist Lucian of Samosata also referred to the belly when he talked about people who measure happiness by their appetites. Writing a couple centuries later, St. Augustine relayed his own experience of this kind of bondage and what it feels like. He talked about how in his earlier life, he had given himself over in different ways to sexual pleasure, and how later when he began to feel more strongly the call to renounce such behaviors and follow Christ, he realized that he couldn't do so, even if he wanted to. He'd made a habit of giving in to his desire for pleasure, and when it came time to renounce such desires, all those years of giving in had created a kind of compulsion in him. He'd become a slave of his belly. And all these years of his past behavior, these, he says, these were the interlinking rings forming what I have described as a chain, and my harsh servitude used to keep me under chains. In other words, this problem that C.S. Lewis and David Courtwright talk about, this isn't something new. It's very old and a very common problem. We human beings, we are creatures who have the capacity to experience all kinds of pleasures of touch, pleasures of taste, pleasure of sight and sound, and none of that is bad. Remember, God was the one who gave us these capacities. He's the one who has made a world filled with things that bring us such pleasure. The problem is not with pleasure itself. The problem is when we begin to be controlled by it. When we make decisions not on the basis of what is true or what is honoring to God or what we know is best for us, but simply on the basis of satisfying some kind of desire. Just think of King David. There's a lot to admire in David. His faith in God, his spiritual sensitivity, his courage in the face of danger. But David was also a man of great flaws, and perhaps his moment of greatest failure happened when, instead of doing what was right, he allowed himself to be controlled by his appetites, and he took another man's wife for himself. Notice how different that is from Moses. Moses was not perfect, of course, but in the book of Hebrews, Moses is praised because although he was raised in the court of Pharaoh and he had every happiness available that money could buy, he was not ruled by it. And when the time came, Hebrews says, he renounced it all to do what was right. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. All of which brings us to the virtue of temperance. Temperance, or self-control, as it's sometimes referred to, is unique among the four cardinal virtues. For, as Joseph Pieper observes, whereas the other three virtues focus in one way or another on the world around us, prudence enables us to understand and act on the truth, justice directs us to what we owe one another, courage prevents us from being hampered or paralyzed by the threats or difficulties we face. Temperance, on the other hand, aims at each man himself. What Pieper means is that Whereas the other virtues are focused on the obstacles that lie outside of us: bad thinking, unjust relationships, threats or dangers from the world around us. While the other virtues help us to overcome those obstacles or equip us to deal with them, temperance focuses on a very different obstacle, one which lies within us. Temperance is not simply the ability or the habit of curbing our desires, nor does it consist in an avoidance of pleasure. Remember, as I've already said, pleasure is not in and of itself a bad thing. Pleasure is a gift. What temperance enables us to do is not to be controlled by it, not to act compulsively or irrationally without really thinking, or in a way that goes against God's will simply because we're being led around by our own wants. Temperance doesn't pretend that we don't experience such feelings. It acknowledges them and helps us to face them. To quote Daniel Westberg, temperance moderates movements of the sense appetites by keeping them consonant with the order of reason and divine law. Most of the time, when Christians have talked about the virtue of temperance, they tend to have usually one of two things in mind: either food and drink on the one hand, or sex on the other. I think that today, in the modern digital age in which we live, we should probably add at least a third, and that is the use of screens. While these three areas of our life are not the only ways that we experience pleasure, while they're not the only things that we do that trigger the reward circuits in our brains, they are certainly three of the most common and three of the most powerful. And if we're going to develop the virtue of temperance, these three are also very good places to begin. So let me say something briefly, at least about a couple of these. First, food and drink. We're all familiar with the problems of excessive overeating or excessive alcohol consumption. I shouldn't need to mention that, for Christians at least, such things have always been considered a vice. In fact, the Christian tradition has a specific name for that vice. We call it gluttony. But gluttony isn't just about overeating or overdrinking. That's not the only form of intemperance when it comes to food and drink. Sometimes the problem may not be that we're eating too much, but maybe that we're obsessed about what we eat. Maybe we dedicate too much of our time or attention or money to food. Or maybe we're on a diet and we're just thinking constantly about what we shouldn't be eating or about what we can and can't eat. The same goes for what we drink. Maybe it's not that we drink to the point of becoming drunk, but maybe we still drink compulsively, or we obsess or we become fastidious over exactly what we drink. Either way, if our experience of food and drink begin to control us, to control our behavior, to control the way we think, to consume our thoughts, then we have become intemperate. And one of the best ways to build our temperance in this area is through the practice of fasting, giving up a meal or certain kinds of food or drink, either for a specific season or as an ongoing spiritual habit. The Bible regularly encourages us to fast. In fact, it expects this as a part of our normal experience. Jesus, when he was giving instructions to his followers about fasting, notice he didn't say if you fast, but when you fast. And when you fast, he said, do not look gloomy like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces that their fasting may be seen by others. His point wasn't to discourage us from fasting, only to warn us against doing it for the wrong reasons. Don't fast, Jesus is saying, because you want others to notice you. Do it as a form of spiritual discipline, as a way to remind yourself that your stomach doesn't control you. Second, I think that if we're going to grow in the virtue of temperance today, then one of the very first places we need to begin is with our use of technology, specifically with our often addictive relationship with screens. I don't think I need to quote any statistic about smartphone usage or screen exposure or cite studies about how easily our brains can become addicted to the dopamine hits that are triggered by these devices. I'm sure you've heard all about it, or you've at least read some article or watched some documentary. The compulsive relationship that most of us have with one or another form of technology is obvious. But I do wonder how often we recognize these compulsive behaviors as a serious moral problem. Not simply because of what we may be looking at on our phones or computer screens, not even because of how many hours we may be spending on them, but simply because we so often do it without thinking. Because our brains have become addicted in some way to the small pleasures that our screens give us, because we've started to lose control, to do things without thinking. That's why many people, Christians and non-Christians alike, have begun to talk about fasting from screens, or switching maybe your phone technology to less addictive forms, to simpler forms, or maybe having specific places in your home where you store devices that you're not using. There's no one simple solution. People have a lot of good suggestions. But all of these efforts, they're all good, because all of them are attempts to not be controlled by addictive pleasure. All of them are attempts to grow in this important virtue of temperance.